Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our SRE Leaders Panel today.
Uh-oh.
On how SREs can help their organizations embrace resilience, but also dive deeper into some very pragmatic questions like what an SRE really is anyway. We'll start with discussion tests, and then we will leave 20 minutes at the end for some open Q&A. And as soon as the recording is ready, we will email all of you the recording of this panel so that you can share it with your team. So please make sure to add questions into the Zoom chat as well so we can answer them live during our Q&A. So with that, I will hand it off to our wonderful panel facilitator, Amy Toby.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Toby, and I'm the staff SRE at Blameless. I've been an SRE and DevOps practitioner since before those names existed, as are my guests here. I love this community, and I believe that SREs are uniquely positioned to change the world in large and small ways. I'm really looking forward to facilitating today's panel, and I'm excited to be joined today by Craig Sebenik, Kurt Andersen, and David Blank-Edelman. They've all lived and breathed SRE for decades, written books, and I'm excited to get into our discussion. So I'll have you each introduce yourselves in alphabetical order, because I couldn't possibly order you otherwise. So with that, Craig, could you go first, please?
Sure. So my name is Craig Sebenik. I am an SRE at Split Software. Split is a small startup, less than 100 people in Redwood City, and we do feature flagging, A/B testing framework. I've been at a number of startups. I was at LinkedIn for a number of years, and just like Amy mentioned, I was doing SRE before it was called SRE. System engineering, even back when it was called sysadmin, etc. So great to be here.
And David.
Hi, I'm David Blank-Edelman. I'm a cloud advocate at a small company called Microsoft that you may have heard of.
Startup.
Yes, that's why it's a small startup, a small multi-billion-dollar startup called Microsoft. I have been in the operations field some 35 odd years in various one of these capacities, and I still consider myself a sysadmin after all this time. I'm the curator and editor of the book Seeking SRE, and a co-founder of the SRECon conferences. And I'm delighted to be here. Thanks.
And Kurt.
I'm Kurt Andersen, and I'm an SRE in our product SRE organization at LinkedIn. We have 3 groups that we broadly divide our SREs in. We've got product, data, and infra. So I'm in our product group, which covers everything that our users touch.
Great. So with that, thank you, everyone. Let's get started. So I wanted to start with, we had a little discussion, be like, what do we want to talk about in this panel? And a couple people brought up like the idea of should SREs code? But Kurt brought up something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is the work is done versus the work is imagined model way of looking at our work. And I feel like this is a great way to talk about SRE work because it's a tool we can use to look at SRE as well as how to look at the work of the people around us so we know what to do for them. And so with that, Kurt, could you give us a quick overview of kind of what the SRE work is done thing is? And then I'll ask Craig to kind of come in and talk about the coding through that lens.
Sure. So work is done versus work is imagined is a concept that comes out of postmortem or an incident retrospective, learning from incidents sort of mindset, where one undertakes an exploratory journey to understand as best you can what actually happened as opposed to what you think happened. But this applies not just in the postmortems of incidents, it also applies, for instance, when you are planning a new project. If you want to implement something to make your SRE team's lives better, it's really important to understand what those lives actually consist of before you try to make them better, not just what you hypothetically want them to be. And one of the areas that this comes to the fore is understanding toil, as an example. That if you, as a senior director, VP of SRE at some organization, have this theoretical concept of SRE is 50% engineering and no more than 50% toil, one hopes. that's a great construct to have in mind. But if that is your imagination and it doesn't align with the way that work is actually being done by the teams, you are setting your teams up for burnout and frustration, and yourself for frustration when you can't align with what is actually hurting the teams and costing them time and effort and brain space.
So another angle on that is a lot of people see SRE work as, I guess, imagined or even prescribed as including a large component of coding, which is kind of how we came to this idea. So I know Craig had something he wanted to bring up around that. So kind of aligning ourselves to the problem as Kurt suggested, which is the automation problems in front of us, the toil problems in front of us, but also like, how do we solve those problems leads into kind of the expectations for us. So how about that, Kurt? Or I mean, Craig.
So yeah, so I've been in a number of startups, and hiring is always a problem, as is with large companies. And one of the complications has been defining SRE. And before you do that, you have to define what DevOps is. And from that, you can get to then, what are you trying to hire for? And so the first thing you have to do is define figure out whether you want a narrow or broad definition of SRE. So if you want a relatively narrow definition, and if you go back to the original idea of SRE, where Ben Traynor said is essentially what happens when you take a software engineer and give them an ops role. So with that in mind, the idea being that you want to solve as many of these problems as you can with software, as opposed to people.
So to take that a little bit further, and I'm gonna hand it off to David here, because he said 35 years in the space. And so one of the things that's been fascinating me over the last few years is how many people have an SRE title, but don't come from software, that comes from systems administration and Knox and kind of the less traditional paths. And a little bit about how kind of those folks come forward into this vision of SRE as a coder in an ops job, but we have ops people in ops jobs that are hopefully learning to automate or doing more of it.
So I'm not sure I can speak for the entirety of the field.
I mean, from your experience.
Yeah, I guess from my experience, and from my experience of having people on my team who came from one of the best sysadmins that ever worked for me was a linguist by training. My experience was that back in the day when we were not quite walking upright, or whatever it is we want to look at those days, we were still realizing, like, hey, it is important to do some automation. And even if we're not getting the software engineering background per se, we are still writing code of some sort that is helping us do repetitive activities, not even scaling activities, just repetitive activities. Okay, I'm tired of doing that. I'm going to make an alias that's called blah, and it's going to just do whatever. It's going to just do the thing, every time I have to do it. So I think that we started down this path of at least understanding that. And then later on, as we started to realize, like, oh, okay, from there, maybe we moved into things like configuration management, where we were attempting to represent our environment, or how to repeat the creation of parts of our environment using stuff that looked a lot like code, even if it was not really code. Maybe it was a DSL of some sort. And so when we started doing that, we're like, okay, so we're starting to build this out. We're building out all these configurations. And then we're like, oh, wait a second. I'm like copying and pasting these two things. Why am I doing that? This one should include that one. And then we're sort of like dragging and screaming into software engineering, principles, and using those wherever possible, because we realized this just doesn't work. Even in the early days of Perl, like, one of the things that it was for people who are lazy, right? Like, that was meant to be a good thing, right? Like, that we didn't want to do these things, right? Say again?
So sysadmins. It's one of the virtues.
Well, sysadmins, or anyone who had to do these things. So, right, like, there was humility and laziness and hubris, I think they were. I can't remember all of Larry Wall's things, but the basic notion is that we've sort of come closer. And so for me, the journey into SRE and the journey into SRE who code came exactly this direction. And then at some point we're like, oh, this source control system, that's kind of important. We could how to use that to keep our stuff, because maybe we want to know who changed what and why, or when. So I think that people have come in through this, and then as we started to in the cloud world think about things like distributed systems, or when we started doing reliability work when we had to deal with somebody else's code, and I had to know enough of whatever that language is or whatever you're doing to be able to read your code. I came closer and closer to that. So I don't, at the moment, I don't consider myself to be a software engineer per se, independent of what Ben says. However, I certainly have picked up as much as I could from that. I just don't do it professionally. And I have so much respect for software engineers that I don't call myself a software engineer, but I for sure have tried to learn everything I possibly could from that field. So that's my brief answer.
Dovetailing back to Craig a little, it sounds like what we're really looking at is bringing in software engineering practices to our approach to toil and automation and infrastructure. And the one that you didn't mention that I when you were talking that reminded me of is that I think especially the Puppet and Chef communities really brought to the forefront is testing. So maybe there's some different gauge than just writing code in a particular language, but instead maybe the practices.
So one thing I want to highlight that David said was essentially you have to define what coding means, right? So do DSLs count? As he mentioned, I mean, the classic old stuff, Puppet Chef, CF Engine, or the newer stuff, Terraform, etc. Do those count? And again, it kind of depends on where you're at and how you want to define them. This idea of a narrow definition or a broad definition, and how much you want to include normal software practices. Software engineering practices. A big one that I run into a lot is when you want to unit test, say Terraform, it can be complicated. However, if you have a higher or lower level language, depending on how you look at it, for example, Python or Go, the unit testing is a little bit more straightforward. So again, it depends on how much you want to incorporate those basic ideas into what you're doing versus relying on the tool itself, AKA the Puppet Chefs, Terraforms of the world.
Well, I think that's mostly a question of the degree of rigor, though. The principles of version control, peer review, code review in some fashion, unit testing, staged release, all of these things sort of build rigor in the team. And if you are, you can practice them individually. It's hard to do peer review individually, but you can do something like that, short of peer reviewing. But you can do all the other things individually if you choose to, but I don't know that that is necessarily just what we're describing as coding. I think you can write in a DSL, perhaps writing the code that interprets the DSL is more what we would think of as the software engineering. But it doesn't take long before you find with any DSL that it needs to be extended because they didn't cover your use case. So that goes back, harkens back to the joys of free and open software, right?
So maybe before you jump in, I just want to say that I think it's not just the coding, but from the software engineering, I also get things like algorithmic analysis. I want to be able to look at a piece of code and figure out how much space it's going to use, how much memory it's going to use, how much CPU it's going to use. Is it, quadratic time? All this, the big O notation that I caught in college is actually useful, right? To be able to at least reason about things like this. Similarly, I think that the stuff that I get from the software engineering world and from the stuff that I've had to pick up coming in from the side as I did is things around failure modes and understanding like, oh, okay, and surely sysadmins know about failure modes, they see it all the time, but after a while you start to see classes, you start to understand these things, you start to understand things like what happens when you have cascading failure. You start to have things about what happens when you have thundering herd problems, where like you everything gets turned on at the same time, and all the devices or systems at once attempt to make the same request, and that knocks you over, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's where I think there is value in getting into that place, even if you're not going to be doing building of large systems, because congratulations, these large systems we build, we're in them as much as we are making them, and so having to understand them is kind of crucial.
You look like you had a thought there, Craig.
So I was just thinking that some of the simplest parts of software engineering, for example, documentation, right? These are things that historically, when I first started doing sysadmin work, if you'd write a 20-line, 30-line Perl script or Bash script, documenting the more complicated pieces, yeah, it didn't happen, right? It was like, yeah, it's just going to live for a few days, right? It's not going to break. It's not going to be there a year from now. So why would I bother documenting? And if you look at one of the core concepts of the Python world, and that is that you read code far more than you write it. So you're making sure that your code is readable, which, especially coming from Perl, which often means that writing something that is potentially not the Perl way or the Pythonic way of doing it, but you write it so it's simple to understand, is probably more valuable than writing some, again, back to Perl, really cool regular expression, parsing, blah, 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 that you literally, the code you wrote 6 months later, you literally have to take 20 minutes to try and figure out what you wrote. So
that's
again,
always been my approach to comments, right? I leave them for the forgetful me.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Right? And it's not like, what did I do? It was like, what did I intend to do?
Yep. Oh yeah, that's another good point about what you intended. And one of the comments that David mentioned about like cascading failures, right? And edge cases, essentially, that you didn't consider. It's like, oh, I wrote this code to do this. So in practice, it doesn't really do that. It's like, oh, right, I forgot about this weird case when, somebody sends an integer as a string, right? Stupid stuff like that.
And,
Well,
and,
and I'd say that also loops back to a certain degree in terms of documentation and work is done or work is imagined, because I end up spending a lot of time reviewing architecture documents that are, we call them RFCs internally, but they're essentially pre-implementation designs. One of the big problems that we have is that those don't ever get updated to reflect the as-built system. If you think about blueprints for a building, there is the design up front, and then there is the as-built version afterwards after a bunch of changes were made along the way.
And as evolved over time, right? Because very few
That's
buildings
right.
stay static, just like people.
That too. Yep.
To take this a little bit further.
I was going to wrench you in an entirely different direction, but just to mention that I also have had I've had really cool conversations with people like Theo from Circonis, in which he was suggesting, in addition to a README, we should be putting an ethics.md in our repositories as well, in which we're trying to speak to not just what it is and what we intended, but also to, as best we can, document what some of the ethical considerations might be around that code or the thing that we're running, what some of the ramifications are, who it might affect, what we have to pay attention to along those lines. And I would love to see more of us in the field pick that up as well and understand, like what we do has impact. It would be darn great if we could try to document that.
Oh, that's interesting, and it's kind of separate. Let's stay off of the licensing.
Oh yeah,
thing.
it's totally separate. I'm just giving you the like here's the thing to think about.
I don't. Craig and Kurt, have you run into any of that in your daily work?
It's certainly an important component of doing internet standards work, and so I've encountered something like that there. I don't know that writing up an ethical consideration statement for a Terraform construct is a terribly great use of time. I'm thinking, yeah, but I'm thinking about some of the metric systems that I'm involved with right now, and the adoption that we're endeavoring to achieve across disparate product groups. And even there, some of the aspects of the measures and the SLIs could have ethical complications, but honestly, to define the latency of a request response into a database, that seems like a bit of a stretch.
How about, Kurt, what goes into that database?
Oh, the data sets, definitely. The data sets have their own data definitions and are defined in a data dictionary of sorts.
How about the training that has to go on for an AI system?
That is an area that definitely involves a lot of assumptions that are worth documenting. Yes.
I think a few of my
I'm not
projects
saying it's completely irrelevant. I'm just saying that it's probably doesn't apply across the board universally.
Oh yeah, I agree. I'm certain that not every little piece of code has to have an ethics statement, but I guess I'm saying that it wouldn't be bad if we, for example, even in a Terraform config, saying this is going up in you know, a region near, this is specifying a region there, and if this region goes down, the following consequences will happen, or whatever. I mean, I just can imagine, like, there is consequences to where we choose to and what infrastructure we allocate to, and it wouldn't, you know, it just wouldn't be a bad idea to be thinking about this a little bit, even if it's the start of that thought.
Maybe in our corporate gigs, the ethics angle isn't as is useful, but definitely like the side effects and the intents seem useful to us. Right. In open source, I guess the ethics would seem a lot more generally applicable.
Well, and major choices like where to deploy a data center or to turn down a data center have driving forces that are well beyond sort of just the software level. They have risk and cost and taxation and all kinds of other factors that go into choices like that. And to the extent that we can document those, I think that documentation is good. So, because then when things change over time, you can at least go back and see these were the assumptions that, or the ground rules, if you like, that went into the choice that was made 3 years ago, for example. And now we can see that 3 of the 5 conditions have changed, and so it no longer makes sense to have X, Y, Z.
Be some small comfort when you're, 3 o'clock in the morning trying to fix a system and you discover and you're going, why? Oh, that's why. Okay. Yeah. I feel better. To take that a little further, I actually had a direction for us to go in that I feel like this is a good segue, is a kind of a growing trend for a while there, and we'll see if it continues, was this idea of taking all the undifferentiated lifting we're doing in our organizations and moving it off to infrastructure as a service or software as a service, right? And there is now, we're in this situation where with the way the economy is behaving in the United States, that people are having to make decisions about what as a service things that they're keeping around on their budget sheets. And there are ethical implications to that. I was wondering if anyone wanted to take that thread and run with it a little bit.
So we obviously we're a small company, and we provide a SaaS service, and therefore we use a bunch of SaaS services as well. There are a number of threads. One of the biggest single consumers of my time is managing all those SaaS vendors. Right now we have several dozen, which for a small company is a lot to manage, especially when the costs are potentially related to the amount of traffic. So as we add more customers, the costs that we have budgeted for our various SaaS vendors also go up, and not necessarily in any kind of obvious relationship, right? It's not linear for each other. Some will plateau out, some will grow exponentially. It all varies. And then obviously, the reason for going with the SaaS vendor is you're trying to balance basically opposed to letting somebody else do X. And does X really solve the problem you're trying to solve?
I think we lost you for just a brief second there, but I think you were saying, talking about how to evaluate a SaaS versus its cost.
So the reason why companies go with SaaS is they want to essentially not hire to do that themselves. They want to do some task, right? And whether they build it internally, the build versus buy argument. And going with SaaS means, okay, we don't have to build this. However, again, we have these potential cost, non-linear cost changes that don't, we have these costs that don't necessarily scale linearly as our company grows. Again, they might grow logarithmically, which would be great, but sometimes they grow exponentially, at least for a period of time. And so managing that is a non-zero amount of time.
I'm not sure how that factors against the ethics of choosing your vendors. I thought that was where the question was. Or did I misunderstand your question, Amy?
That's kind of where I was pushing, but you know, I'll let you all take it where you're going to go. I'm the moderator here. But yeah, it was about, like, you know, as we move forward, right, we're going to have to make decisions, right? And some of these things are going to be really critical to our business, and they're a critical part of our hot path. And some things are a little bit further out, but still kind of important to, say, back office processes and things like that. So how do we balance all that as SREs, especially considering how you know, low level we are in terms of integrating those services and the cost of unintegrating them even?
Mm-hmm.
So I can speak a little bit to this, but I want to make sure that my biases or my conflict of interests are totally out there. So I'm from a provider of those services, right? A large provider of those services. And so obviously there's some value to us that people consume them and pay us for it. So just setting that aside, I think that I don't always agree with everything that Microsoft does, obviously, but one of the things I'm pretty interested in is the work they're starting to do around talking about sustainability and the efforts around that, because there are ethical choices in terms of how much you consume. And it's a very interesting conversation to have, because often the way to get to better sustainability is to consume less, right? And so it's an interesting balance of a conversation here. And so what I was going to say for this as SREs is that as we think about this, it may be the case that we're going to be pivoting a little bit, especially in this time, towards things like performance analysis or cost optimization or stuff like that. Can we reduce our spend? Can we reduce what we're consuming? And there are just like activities around scaling also help with reliability, activities around sustainability also help with around optimization also help around with sustainability as well, because you realize, oh, okay, like we didn't need to run that all the time. That's kind of cool, you know, where, you know, less fuel, and we can actually see in some sort of a sustainability-o-meter that we're actually using fewer trees or something, or planting more trees. I don't know which, you know, like, but so I think that to meld your ethical plus SRE question, I think that's one place where this stuff touches, is how much we consume and our capacity as SREs to help our companies and our organizations determine that and reduce that where possible, where it makes sense, or increase that, like if it makes sense to take your stuff out of your data center and give it to a cloud provider, which is allegedly running, and in theory is running more efficiently than your data center is because they have larger scale, that may be a positive thing. Again, conflict of interest noted. So
right.
Well, and I think one of the things you touch on there, David, in terms of raising sustainability as a consideration factor, is that I find a lot of choices, SREs tend to be biased toward build it, I think. Most software developers tend to be biased toward let's build it. But factoring in considerations of cost, risk, and especially I'll say total cost of ownership or of operation, because if you look at the typical software development lifecycle, it is, number one, very waterfall biased. I'll put it that way. But it also talks about developing the software in the very name of it. It has nothing to do with the cost of running that stuff forever, or hypothetically forever. And we need to have a much more comprehensive view of the software lifecycle, be less focused on the development phase and more concerned with the total lifecycle and total consumed effort over the lifespan of a given product. And it's a mindset change that takes some educating to get people to think about, from the very point where something is conceived until the point where it's decommissioned and the code is deleted from your code base. That is the life cycle. And you need to figure out what it takes throughout that whole time, including all the patch changes along the way and everything else with that software.
I think Craig was holding a thought.
One of the other ethical considerations to weigh is the essentially R&D costs. One of the things you see right now, no offense to David, but the big cloud providers, obviously their customers want more and more services to be offered. And they offer them, which then starts competing with essentially the original creators. One of the biggest places you see this, well, at least from my perspective, is Amazon recently announced their Kafka, managed Kafka service. Yet Confluence, the original creators essentially of Kafka, they have their own service. So they're essentially competing. And so AWS essentially is using Confluence / LinkedIn's R&D over the past decade to create a service. And so is it really ethical for you to, even though it might be easier to use, if you're an AWS customer, even though it might be easier to use the hosted Kafka from AWS, is it more ethical to use Confluence? And there's a bunch of pricing considerations, but.
Ooh, ethically
or Redis,
software.
I think earlier was
Sure.
was
Redis,
a point.
If you go back to their roots, it's kind of where they started, right? With Zen and in Linux. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, are my hands clean, to quote Sweet Annie and the Rock? You know, it's a really good question. I don't even know how to begin. And you know, like I think you can take pot shots at Microsoft around this too, for sure. So
Sure.
And I think it's a really good hard question. I didn't know how we got here, but it's a tricky question. Let's put it that way. If I sound nervous.
Well, and then you
so
could raise the question as an SRE: should you be supporting, if you happen to work for one of these companies, should you be supporting the use of free software as a packaged service to sell to other companies, or what's the responsibility there as far as contributing back to the open source software movement?
So I'll say two things. One is I think we're now at that ship. I think is kind of sailed in terms of the, will open source be something that will be in your life, and whether you buy it or download it from GitHub or whatever, you know, it's still a thing. So I think that's true. But it does lead me to the interesting question about SRE when it comes to packaged software. And, you know, we talk a lot as SREs about situations where we have a development group and we're building our own software and stuff like that. But I spend lots and lots of time with people, and I was certainly in that realm for a long time, of here's the thing I get off the shelf. I'm an SRE, keep it reliable. And that's a challenge that I don't think the SRE world has thought very much about, probably because the origins of this work are from, you know, companies that had the ability to spin up large groups to build what they needed along these lines.
There have been a number of talks from people talking about how you SRE commercial off-the-shelf software at SRECon over the last couple of years.
And I like
Craig
them.
Break in real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
You had something to say, Ed.
Yeah, I think I lost it.
Oh, okay.
So Kurt, what's like do you have any of the ideas that came out of those talks? I have seen them myself, but like, what do we tell people who are on this call who are like, yeah, I'm big into the SRE thing, but you know, my company runs X,
right?
That we purchased.
So, and we have implemented in certain cases, and the general approach that seems to have been found useful, I'll say, is to wrap said software with some sort of framework that allows you to get useful metrics out of it. Because measuring things is usually not something that commercial off-the-shelf software has been real strong at in terms of exposing useful APIs for measuring its behavior. So putting it inside of some sort of package where the package gives you those measurements seems to be the most common approach, whether that's Dockerizing it or whatever, or putting it with a sidecar like Istio or Envoy, so that you can run it and get some meaningful intelligence about how it's functioning and how you can tear it down and spin it back up on demand, and the normal sorts of dynamic things you would want to do in a distributed environment.
The only other thing that I've also seen, so I think that's exactly the first place I go as well. And I was thinking about, okay, well, that's cool. That gives you the ability to know about your reliability, but how do we as SREs make an impact on that reliability? The only place that I've heard is, sometimes you can stick a caching layer in front of things, that can help in that sort of ways. But to me, it's really tricky, because that's where this goes back to our coding discussion. This is all of the same ilk. Like, congratulations, you bought a piece of software, you have it well monitored, it sucks. Now what?
I mean, but when you guys talking about this, it had me thinking about the DBA and DBRE communities. Right, and that's their whole life. I mean, except for a few exceptions at LinkedIn, Microsoft, Google.
You should expand the acronym just for other people, because
okay,
I know what
so DBA, Database Administrator, which is probably what it's been ever since back when we were all sysadmins, and it's still kind of a common term. And then DBRE is kind of the SRE equivalent for database administrators, so database reliability engineering. So you had me thinking of that, because that's you get MySQL, right, and it's gotten a lot better, but you still get kind of the stuff that was imagined by the MySQL developers, and then you have this really long, if ever possible, product loop for feedback.
Oh, well, but MySQL is open source. If you went to something like Oracle, is where, or SQL Server, MS SQL, whatever it is, that's where you've got this box, hermetically sealed box, if you like, that you have very limited knobs and metrics coming out of,
or somebody else's SaaS system, or a PaaS system, just to roll this whole thing. Let's just make this into one big Gordian knot, shall we?
Sure.
Right. So Craig, I would love to hear from you about some of this, because like if congratulations, you're dependent on somebody else, what do you do?
Others are dependent on us, right? Becomes this whole series of dominoes. Yep.
So how do you handle a situation where you don't necessarily have the ability to directly influence the reliability of the core thing that you are depending on, right? Which is kind of one of our purveys.
Yep. So one of the big differences in being a SaaS provider, as opposed to the conversations around, the one I'll mention is Jira, right? So if you've implemented Jira locally, not as a cloud vendor, but you've implemented Jira locally, how do you make it reliable such that all your teams don't go down when you upgrade Jira, for example? The big difference with a SaaS provider is we have a bunch of software in between all these providers and then what we provide to customer. So what we do is, to your point, we add caching layers, right? Essentially, right? And how do you distribute the data? How do you fail gracefully when one of these providers fails? But one of the biggest things we do is our onboarding of another SaaS vendor is, even for somebody as small as we are, is relatively rigorous. So we go through is like, what do you do in case of a failure? What happens? One of the big concerns we have is security. So since we take essentially customer data and we store some of it, how do the providers, how do they, for example, encrypt it, right? And what do they do? So we go through this relatively formal process. And
I really like that, because of the way it kind of, if we're all doing it, it kind of creates this net for raising the bar for all of us.
So it pushes everybody up. Exactly. So the big thing we do is when we onboard a new vendor, which we do almost literally every couple of weeks, we ask them a bunch of questions about reliability and redundancy. And then we to come full circle, we go back to product and say, hey, what happens if this vendor is not available and this piece of our service, because it is rare that a single vendor would take down our whole service, depending how you define vendor. Obviously, if AWS goes down, we're screwed. But so does this vendor, if it goes down and it takes down this piece of a service, how important is that to our customers? And then that starts a bigger conversation about, okay, if it's really important, then we add in more layers of protection within our software to essentially at least provide the read path. Maybe not the right path, but at least the read path so the customers can continue to operate.
Okay, Craig, I've got one last question for you.
Yeah.
I hope we can ask each other questions. How did you learn what questions to ask your vendors?
So a lot of it has been, to be blunt, a lot of it came from LinkedIn. When you see things scale at large size, it's like you see weird shit. Sorry, PG-13.
Okay. We're not on NPR.
Yeah. You see weird edge cases, and there are things that you just never thought of. And to be honest, there are questions that continue to pop up. One of the big ones that I have not focused on a lot in my career is security concerns. You look at LinkedIn security concerns, minus the payment piece, most of LinkedIn security concerns are relatively light. But my current company, some of our customers are big banks, for example, which obviously have major security concerns. And so those security questions continue to evolve. And so I think one of the biggest things you can do is try to take lessons from the big companies, not because they're necessarily doing things right, but because they've seen all kinds of weird things, but don't take them wholesale.
Right.
Take what they say, figure out what applies to you, take those pieces and continue to evolve them. Don't remain static. Don't say, these are our questions forever and ever. It's like every couple of months, just review them and say, do these questions still make sense? Especially if you have a new failure, you have right, we're supposed to stop using postmortem because
post-incident review?
Incident review, thank you. You have an incident review. It's like, hey, where does this fit into our vendor review? Does it fit?
Well, that was my question, was actually also specifically, have you have outages that have led to better questions for your vendors?
Ooh.
Yes. They are relatively small for each outage.
Sure.
Over time, they have led to 30%, 50% change in the vendor review process. So I mean, that's over the course of a couple of years, which again, goes back to this point of you have to continue to evolve it, right? Continue to review all of your processes and say, hey, how has this changed? And part of that comes back to the raising the bar thing. As the vendors improve, right, then your questions can also become, hit more and more edge cases, and they can evolve as well as the entire industry evolves. And so hopefully 10 years from now, this will be significantly more sophisticated than it is today.
I really like that. That brings us up to time for Q&A. We had one very good question. So thank you all for the discussion. I learned a few things listening to you. I hope our audience did. So I'm going to open up to Q&A. If y'all have questions, if you pop them into that Q&A box now, I will get to them. But to start with, we have a question from Eric, primarily for Kurt, but open to anyone answering. How has the classification of SRE roles into product, data, and infrastructure types helped make your implementation of SRE successful? How are the approaches of each team different or the same? What are the pitfalls to be aware of?
Good question. I would say to a certain extent that it is an administrative division from a span of control and focus. But also I would say it allows the teams to be partnered with their development teams in different ways. So our product SREs function in a largely embedded role with specific portions of our product space. So for instance, your profile on LinkedIn is developed and maintained by a group that we call the profile team. And there are profile SREs who are embedded with those developers. So product-wise, the product SRE teams are split up by product areas. Data teams are split up more along a technology framework. So there are Kafka SREs, there are Oracle SREs, there are various other SREs having to do with different types of data storage technologies. And we have some streaming ones. So our SAMSA, which is also an open source streaming technology, we have SAMSA SREs. Infrastructure is sort of a catch-all to a certain degree. The infrastructure SREs support what we have at LinkedIn is called the foundation team. It's our what other companies might call their DevOps engineers. They're the ones who build the tools that the developers use for deployment and testing and everything else. So infra SRE supports the foundation team. They also support some of our in-house private cloud technology. They support things like performance engineering. And so they're able to focus, they kind of have a mixture of foci in their space.
And were there any pitfalls with that?
The pitfalls are what I would say is the typical pitfalls of any sort of organizational distinction, in that you have to be careful not to allow siloization. And you have to, whenever you've got multiple levels of hierarchy that you may have to traverse, you have to make sure that you keep good communication going.
Cool. Craig or David, did you have something to pitch in on that question?
No, I was terribly interested in the answer too.
Interesting, because being at startups for quite a while now, I actually have more exposure to the reverse problem. You know, what happens when you don't have a team of SREs with that specific title? And one of the things you have to remember is it isn't so important that you have an SRE person, but the SRE work gets done. So when you're smaller, startups, they have, people have a number of different hats. And so I've seen two kind of approaches where you essentially try and take a developer, have them wear an SRE hat as well, or you take a dedicated SRE and you have them kind of jump between teams. In my experience, the latter works better than the former. And the biggest problem is this competition between product features and, quote, reliability features.
Yeah.
Now, reliability should be part of the product, but that's a different discussion. But you have this push and pull between, you know, the product desires and kind of the stability desires. Having somebody just focus on stability, even if that means they have to learn the quirks of every team, has been generally more successful than trying to take somebody who has more product focus and have them also focus on reliability. That's my take.
Okay, cool. So we have one more question. This one should be kind of fun. From Hesham. Does SRE replace or complement DevOps? And I'm going to have David go first, and then Craig, and then Kurt.
I feel very strongly that it is a complement because, in my opinion, SRE and DevOps, though complementary modern operations practices, in my opinion, focus on different things. The way I have come to understand it is, if the keyword for SRE is reliability, one possible keyword for DevOps would be delivery. And I believe, though they intersect in certain ways, that those are different and it's a different foci. Just like I don't think that SRE, even though they touch on into the realm of security, replace security, there's a complementary thing here. These are all people working on different things. In practice, I think that DevOps has, in addition to its different foci, there's definitely overlaps, but DevOps has focused on different things traditionally, and the way it gets practiced is complementary to the way SRE gets practiced. I am a big fan of DevOps people taking and doing SRE practices. And taking SLIs and SLOs. I don't think there's no licensing fee. You can immediately start doing these sort of things or any requirement along these lines. And I'm a big fan of the SRE folks learning things like around collaboration, which I think is a big, and the COM acronyms and stuff like that. I think all those things roll into SRE as well. I think there's a lot to be learned here. For sure, complementary. There is no big, when you're a jet sort of like dance number in which they square off and fight, in my opinion.
And Craig.
So there's a pretty good video on YouTube from Liz Fung Jones about essentially to take an OO approach where she says
class SRE implements DevOps.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the first thing you have to start with is how do you define those terms, right? And your definition then kind of trickles down into how you implement it. And so if you define DevOps as essentially merging dev and ops, then SRE and DevOps, they are essentially two sides of the same coin, right? They're different flavors of the same thing, and you can look at it that way. If you look at DevOps as the team that writes the tools for CI/CD and monitoring and blah, 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 then I think they could be the same thing. When I talked to somebody from Google years ago, they had essentially two different types of SRE, where they had the embedded SRE that worked directly with the product teams, and they had what they called SRE suites, right? The ones that essentially wrote the tools. And if you take that definition where DevOps is the implementation of all these tools, then essentially your DevOps team is your SRE suites, and your SREs that are embedded with the teams are your SREs. But in the end, it all just comes down to the terms you want to use that happen to work for how you've done your recruiting, how your company is organically grown. In the end, it doesn't matter. As long as the work gets done, who does it and what title they have really doesn't matter.
Here. And Kurt?
I think, as you pointed out, Craig, it's all in the definition. And as David started off by saying that there are areas of focus with lots of overlap. So I do think that there are slightly distinct areas of focus, and I think Craig highlighted that too. So I'm in full agreement with everything they said.
I'll take this opportunity to put a little plug, because I'm doing a whole talk about this at FailoverConf, where the title is the future of DevOps is resilience engineering, and this topic is very much what I'm going to be talking about. So, but go ahead, David.
I was just going to say I'm a big fan of Tom Michelli's comparison of the two, which also shows up, and he was kind enough to allow me to put it in the book, which is this notion. Tell me, is this the left side of your screen that I'm pointing at here?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Okay, awesome. So he suggests that DevOps people focus on going from somebody's laptop to production, and they're looking in that direction. And he suggests that SREs start at production and look backwards in the way they think about things. How do I get the stuff into production that makes sense? And I find that and there's a lovely picture of this, to be really helpful in my understanding of it as well, that DevOps folks think about how to move into production, and SRE folks think about how to make production what you want by figuring out how things, by looking backwards. And that's one of the ways I've come to understand the difference along these lines, but I think we can all be friends.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's all the time we have left. So thanks so much for attending, everyone. A huge thank to our panelists, Kurt, Craig, and David. I hope everyone enjoyed our chat today and got as much from it as I did. If you have any other ideas for ways we can band together and help our community or stay connected in this time of social distancing, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, Miss Amy Tobey, MISSAMYTOBEY. Our SRE Leaders Panel is a recurring series, or we're hoping it is. And so we encourage you to follow us on Twitter, BlamelessHQ, and stay tuned for the next one. Please share your ideas with us on Twitter or otherwise, and I look forward to hearing from you all. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.